Odesa and the Odesa region are officially mourning today. All of Ukraine is in mourning. Russian terrorists attacked a residential building in Odesa on Saturday night. Hello, this is Pavlo Shteremok speaking from Kyiv, Ukraine, UATV English studio in a weekly attempt to bring the hardest truths in easy terms for the whole free world directly from Ukraine. 10 people died, among them 3 women and 3 children aged from 3 years, 8 months and 4 months. Once again, the children were 3 years, 8 months and 4 months old. Many photos and videos with these victims have already been published on the internet, and these are creepy shots. After all, people rejoice at simple life events on them, coming out on the maternity ward, the first emotions of a small child. It's gross. But all this was interrupted by Russian terrorists.
The world has enough missile defense systems to protect against Shahed drones and missiles, and delaying the supply of weapons to Ukraine, missile defense systems to protect our people, leads unfortunately to such losses, to the fact that the list of children whose lives Russia takes away constantly grows. Ukraine asks for nothing more than necessary to protect lives. When lives are lost and partners are simply playing internal political games and disputes that limit our defense, it's impossible to understand. It's unacceptable, and it will be impossible to forget. The world will remember this.
Prosecutor General of Ukraine Andriy Kostin said that the Russians purposefully attacked a residential building in Odesa. This building is not adjacent to any military facility or dual-purpose facility. This house is located in a densely built-up area. That is why it is not just shedding, it is a policy aimed at terror and destruction of Ukrainians, Kostin said. By the way, just a week ago, the former president of Russia, Medvedev, stated that Odesa is a Russian city. Therefore, the destruction of Ukrainians is also a continuation of this genocidal policy. Although, in fact, Odesa was never Russian, no matter how much they wanted it. And although this city was allegedly found by Catherine II, in fact, Cossack settlements were there long before the birth of the Russian Tsarina, and the old cemeteries in the suburbs of the city are a clear proof of that. The attack on the residential building in Odesa is a continuation of a series of bloody terrorist acts by Russia, with attacks on the Dnipro, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Izium and other cities of Ukraine. And these terrorist acts must be stopped as soon as possible, because the blood count of the war started by Russia is only increasing. My condolences to all the relatives and friends of the deceased. This week, political and military analysts are talking about the latest statements of French President Emmanuel Macron. He stated that sending the Western troops to Ukraine cannot be ruled out in future. But this is still the level of thinking. Ukraine has not yet officially requested this from partner countries. Meanwhile, international partners support Ukraine in other important issues: the provision of weapons and ammunition, training of Ukrainian military, joint projects in the defense industry, etc. The presence of such a discussion among Western partners is another evidence of the falsehood of enemy propaganda that Russia is already fighting with NATO in Ukraine. The involvement of NATO troops for the defense of Ukraine will be possible only after Ukraine joins the alliance. Furthermore, given the growth Russian threat to the free world, this scenario cannot be ruled out in the future. So perhaps Macron is strategically thinking ahead of his time. Ukraine needs military aid because it keeps the Russian army from invading NATO countries, especially since Ukraine has proven its capabilities in the fight against the Russians. During the winter, 3 Russian ships were sunk: Novocherkassk, Ivanovets, Cezary Kunikov. And our air defense forces were also effective, especially in recent days. Since February 17th, the Ukrainian air forces have destroyed 14 enemy aircraft. That's an average of 1 per day, mainly Su-34 and Su-35 fighter bombers. And during the winter, the Russian Federation lost 2 A-50 long-range radar detection and control aircraft, of which the enemy has very few units. Nowadays, more and more countries are signing security agreements with Ukraine. Such documents are signed with Great Britain, Germany, France, Denmark, Canada, Italy and the Netherlands. Volodymyr Zelensky signed such a document with the Netherlands already this week.
Нідерланди активно допомагають нам
By the way, the Netherlands is actively helping us with air defense with F-16 coalition. This year, new fighter jets will be in our skies, and we have to make this year an effective one in defending ourselves against Russian-guided bombs, Russian aircraft and their missiles.
Also, this week, important news came from the European Parliament. First, the deputies confirmed the decision to allocate 50 billion euros of support to our country. And secondly, for the first time, it was officially recognized that Ukraine's decisive victory may lead to genuine changes in the system in the Russian Federation. In particular, de-imperialization, decolonization, and re-federalization, all of which are necessary conditions for the establishment of democracy in Russia. However, Russians, and especially Putin, continue to actively prepare for the show called the presidential election. It is very difficult to call it anything other than a well-staged performance. After all the political opponents of Putin are now either in prison like Girkin, or barred from the elections like Nadezhdin, or killed like Nemtsov or Navalny, who was buried on Friday. Moreover, Russia is preparing for the elections in the occupied Ukrainian territories, which of course cannot be recognized. Elections in Russia, for which preparations have already begun in the occupied territories, cannot be recognized.
There is a different Russia. There is a better Russia than the Russia that Mr. Putin and his criminal kleptocratic entourage in the Kremlin stand for. And we as European Union will continue the fight of the Russian opposition against the regime of Mr. Putin. And for many reasons, it's so extremely important that Russia doesn't succeed against Ukraine. To the contrary, that Ukraine, in the end, will be victorious, because the Ukrainian model of a free and open society, of being a democracy, that is considered being a threat by an autocrat, by a dictator like Mr. Putin, who doesn't want this for his own country because he would fear that his position might be endangered.
Now the Kremlin is starting an information campaign about the fact that terms of office of the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada and Volodymyr Zelensky are coming to an end. However, due to the restrictions of martial law, the next parliamentary elections were not held in Ukraine on October 29, 2023, and the next presidential elections were not held on March 31, 2024. This is understandable because during the martial law, the holding of elections is prohibited by the legislation of our country, and the powers of state authorities continue until its conclusion. Ukraine cannot hold elections because of Russian aggression. It cannot guarantee the security of this process. It cannot hold them in the occupied territories with the involvement of our citizens, for whom any contact with Ukraine may now cost their lives. And by the way, we are not the first, because during the World War, we have already seen postponement of elections. The postponement of elections due to war is not a unique situation in world practice. The British Parliament, elected in 1935, was not re-elected in 1940 and ruled the country for 10 years. Prime Minister Winston Churchill relied on this parliament during the Second World War. And by the way, there is another question. And what will happen to Putin's legitimacy after March 17th? After all, Putin is re-elected in undemocratic conditions without an alternative of observers. These elections do not meet international standards. They will be held in occupied Mariupol, in the occupied regions of Ukraine under the muzzles of machine guns, where forced passportizing was carried out. After that, will the West, which does not recognize Lukashenko as president, recognize Putin as the president of Russia? The West is wondering how to deal with the illegitimate Putin after March 17th. Because the Ukrainian government was elected in democratic and legitimate elections recognized by the whole world in 2019. All political opponents congratulated Zelensky on his victory, and the principle of continuity of power is laid down in our constitution. It is in effect. All institutions work and will work until the new council, cabinet of ministers or president take office. After all, it is worse to hold undemocratic and illegitimate elections in conditions of war. Even now, there is a consensus among political forces and society in Ukraine that elections should be held after the end of martial law. Consider, should Putin be legitimate or condemned? And now it's time for more on UATV English. You ask hard questions and we try to answer in easy terms. The question of the week has been voiced by our viewer, John Sharin 5726, and that question sounded like, is Ukraine pursuing bilateral alliances with the countries talking about sending troops? The short answer is no. Long answer, not yet. As I said, Ukraine did not ask other countries to send their troops to our territory yet. First, we are still coping with the second army of the world with the power of our soldiers. And we would be grateful for weapons, equipment and ammunition. We really don't have this now, although in Russia, with all its greatness, there is none either. After all, there are currently active purchases of military missiles in North Korea, kamikaze drones in Iran, and mercenaries in the territories of African and Asian countries. Secondly, we understand that a foreign contingent on Ukrainian territory is a direct involvement of countries in the war against Russia. No matter how untrained their military might be, there are a lot of them, and fighting against them is a challenge for any country. Sadly, all the statements of Macron or other world politicians and their initiative and historical role. Nowadays, of course, you can sit behind the screen of pacifism or not everything is so clear, but from the point of view of history, all steps will be evaluated by our descendants. And long-term decisions in certain parliaments regarding aid to Ukraine and decisions not to provide some Taurus long-range missiles. And such statements as Macron made, they can really become historic. Tectonic movements in the war against Ukraine have already begun. Finally, because as Macron himself stated, and the Ukrainians repeatedly said, there was once a ban on providing Ukraine with tanks, anti-aircraft missiles and fighter jets. 2 of these 3 taboos have already been overcome. F-16 fighters will soon be in Ukraine. Therefore, these words, there will be no NATO soldiers here, will someday also sound like another overcome taboo. And in order to overcome it even easier, not much is needed: the entry of Ukraine into the alliance. That seems to be it for tonight and for the week. It was Pavlo Stelmach in UATV English, breaking the hard truths in easy terms for the whole free world directly from Ukraine as usual. We like you, and we hope the feeling is at least somewhat mutual. Like us in return, subscribe and share. Help us to promote Ukrainian voice worldwide. Stay safe and tuned for more right already on tomorrow.